Yeah, great. So thanks, and thanks for having me here. It's been a very exciting couple of days, being stimulated by the wide range of talks on a diverse range of topics. I think I can imagine, somebody coming to this conference and just not necessarily seeing what was in common among all of the talks that we've seen, but I think there are things that jump out. So in particular, if we look at the clip art that people have been using, I've seen this one a few times, right? So maybe that's ear biting or something like that. And this guy seems to show up reasonably often, right? So if you put those two together, though, I think you get the idea that what we're trying to understand is something about the existence of language, or perhaps the properties that languages have. And that we want to do that in terms of something like evolution, although there's variation in whether people talk about this in terms of cultural or biological evolution. So to locate the talk that I'm going to give today in terms of these dimensions, what I'm going to be talking about is how it is that we might end up getting languages that have particular properties, and I'm going to focus on how it is that cultural evolution can be involved in that kind of process. Having determined these dimensions, there are still other things that we need to decide in order to offer an account of the cultural evolution of language. So one thing that we need to decide is the kind of level of analysis at which we think about these evolutionary processes operating. One level of analysis is to think about the things that are evolving as entire languages. That is, the language is itself the unit, which is the thing that's being passed from person to person, from generation to generation. So in thinking this way, what we imagine is we have sort of generations of learners, each of whom have a language inside their head. That's what these red and blue dots are. And what's changing is the composition of the population in terms of the languages which appear inside people's heads. And this is a kind of approach that, for example, is taken in models that have been used by Martin Novak, Natalia Komarova, Partha Niyogi, and so on. Another kind of perspective that you can have on where it is that evolution fits into this picture is one where we think about the things that are evolving as being the linguistic elements. That is, the sounds or words or constructions that appear within a language. And we think about evolutionary dynamics applying to those. And so this is, for example, like Bill Croft's account, thinking about linguines, constructions, which are the things which are changing in their proportions as we go across successive generations of language learners. Having made a decision about the level of analysis, there are still other things that we have to think about in terms of offering these evolutionary accounts. And one important one is what kinds of evolutionary forces we see as being relevant to providing explanations for things like the properties of languages that we observe. So if you look at the kind of evolutionary forces that people think about in the context of biological evolution, they break down into selection, which is the thing that probably springs to mind for most of us when we talk about evolution, the adaptation of organisms to their environment through a process of differential reproductive fitness, resulting in greater proliferation of one species over another. But there are other important forces at work, things like mutation, which is responsible for producing genetic variation. And in biological evolution is perhaps relatively boring. The transmission process for biology is one where these mutations end up being essentially random errors, although there's some variation in the way that people think about that. The final force being one which is the consequence, say, of operating in a finite population where the stochastic dynamics of the fact that we have these kinds of processes operating, together with the fact that the population is finite, result in something like genetic drift, which is a force that can result in fixation of particular traits, just as a consequence of the dynamics of that stochastic process. So when we think about evolutionary explanations in general, we don't necessarily have all three of these forces spring to mind. In particular, I think that for most of us, the one that we think about is selection. And you can think about this as a kind of biological contamination. So in biological evolution, when people are trying to explain the traits that organisms have, selection is normally the thing that they're appealing to. And I think that kind of bias shows up whenever people think about trying to apply evolutionary approaches at the level of cultural evolution in terms of the kinds of evolutionary forces that they see as being at work. So accounts of language evolution that are inspired by biology also tend to emphasize the role of selection when explaining the properties of languages. And that's true of all of the kinds of models that I mentioned before. Novak, Komarova, Niyogi, Croft, and so on, are thinking about selection as being one of the primary forces which is responsible for producing the properties that languages end up having. It's worth pointing out that this view of cultural evolution is something that's quite controversial. So in the more general literature arguing about what processes are at work in cultural evolution, people like Scott Atran, Pascal Boyer, and Dan Sperber have made arguments that thinking about cultural evolution in terms of basically sort of a process which is just noisy, error-prone replication guided by selection is perhaps misleading. So the reason why they see a disanalogy is that in biological evolution, when information is transmitted across generations, the sort of mechanism that does that, while it might be kind of fun, is nonetheless kind of boring from the perspective of trying to think about what changes are happening to the information that's being transmitted. Essentially, the mutations that take place are just random errors that are the result of misfires of that biological mechanism. Whereas in cultural evolution, when information is transmitted across generations, what's happening is information is being passed through the minds of individual learners, creating the opportunity for biases of memory and learning to be things that influence the outcome of that evolutionary process. And so this raises a question, which is, what kind of evolutionary forces do we need in order to give an explanation for particular properties that we might observe language as having? And in order to answer that kind of question, we need to develop a certain kind of mathematical model. So in biology, the strategy that's taken for trying to figure out if selection is at work is using what's called a neutral model. So basically, a neutral model is something which indicates what happens in the absence of selection. So these neutral models give us a tool that we can use for then setting up a kind of null hypothesis against which we can evaluate the things that we see in the world. If you can show that the phenomenon that you want to explain is something that results just as a consequence of that neutral model, then there's not necessarily a need to appeal to selection in order to explain the phenomena that you're looking at. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is talk about some neutral models in the context of language evolution. That is, models that we can use to think about whether processes of selection, either at that level of entire languages or at the level of individual constructions, are things that we need to appeal to in order to explain the phenomena that we're interested in. So basically the way the talk's going to work, I'll start off talking about that language level, and then I'll talk about the element level, thinking about what happens when we look at the evolution of individual constructions. So the place where we're going to start in terms of trying to work out these models is by looking at the basic mathematics that's often used in biology for modeling how it is that mutation and selection influence the composition of a population. So this is the last talk, or second last talk on the last day of the conference. It's late in the afternoon. It seems like it's the appropriate moment. The lights are dim, right? We should do some math, right? That's the thing that should happen right now. I know you guys have been hanging out for it. Okay, so a standard model that's used to look at the influence of selection and mutation in biology is something called the Replicator Dynamics. And this is a relatively hairy kind of looking equation so that we can unpack it a little bit. Basically, what it's doing is saying that the rate of change of the proportion of the population of a particular type is determined by the probability that a type I parent has a type J child, together with the fitness of type I, which in the biological model essentially corresponds to the number of offspring which are associated with that particular type. So what it says is that the rate of change of that proportion we get by summing over all of the possible types in the population, taking the proportion of that type xi, multiplying it by the fitness of that type to get an estimate of how many offspring that type is going to have, and then looking at the probability that each of those offspring mutates into the type that we're interested in. And that's what's going to give us the proportion of the population at the next moment in time. And then there's this extra thing over here on the right-hand side, which you don't have to worry about. That just makes sure that the population proportions sum up to 1. So the real action is in the first term of that equation. So we can break this down and sort of express it in a slightly more intuitive way. So this is a dynamics which is defined in terms of an infinite population, but we can find a simple finite population. Here we have a population which just has, say, 4 individuals at each generation. And what we want to do is to give an account of how it is that we go from that population at time t, here I'm going to assume we have discrete time, to a population at the next moment in time. And the way that the replicator dynamics works is it says, first of all, we'll look at that population, and then we'll kind of increase the proportional representation of each of those different types based on the biological fitness that's associated with those types. So basically what that's doing is allowing those types which are going to have more children to have a sort of greater representation in the population. And then what we do is for each of the offspring that we're going to end up having, we're going to choose a parent who is going to be the parent of that offspring, and we choose that according to the weights in the population, which are Oh, it's back now. I don't know. Should I keep going with this one? Okay. I'll call on you in a moment. Okay. So we choose randomly from the previous population, and then we have biological transmission, which then determines the probability that we end up with an offspring of type J. Right? So we're going to choose our parent of type I. The probability distribution of offspring we end up with is determined by those mutation probabilities. And then we repeat this process, and basically what happens is that the individuals who have greater fitness are more likely to be selected through this reproductive process, and as a consequence, the composition of the population of the next generation changes. Everybody gets replicator dynamics? Yeah? Okay. So basically, what this equation does is it tells us about how two of those evolutionary forces contribute to the dynamics of evolution. It tells us about mutation in the form of the probability that individuals have children of different types, and it tells us about selection expressed here in terms of biological fitness. It doesn't incorporate drift, that third effect that I was talking about, because here we assume an infinite population, and I'll come back to drift later on in the talk. But for now, this gives us a kind of framework that we can use for looking at influences of things like mutation and selection on the outcome of evolutionary processes. And while I've been talking about biological evolution, it's reasonably straightforward to translate this over to a model for cultural evolution, where basically now what we do is we think about the fitness of an individual, not necessarily directly in terms of the number of offspring that they have or so on, but just as a factor which influences the probability that somebody would choose to learn from that person. Right? So basically it's affecting how likely you are to go and try and get information from that person. And then cultural transmission replaces biological transmission as the process that determines what language you end up with as a consequence of learning a language from that individual. And this is a sort of analysis of cultural evolution that's the kind of thing that's been pursued by Boyd and Richardson for cultural evolution in general, and is the kind of thing that we see in the models by Martin Novak and colleagues that I mentioned before. So what we'd like to do in order to define a neutral model is ignore the component of this model which has to do with fitness, and just focus in on the part of the model which concerns cultural transmission. And so what we'd like to be able to do is to define an approach which is going to allow us to get good estimates of what those cultural transmission processes do, what those parameters Qij correspond to, and it's also going to allow us to work out what the consequences are of evolutionary processes that just incorporate cultural transmission, so that we can determine whether those are sufficient to explain the phenomena that we might be interested in explaining. Having set up the problem in that way, it might be a bit of a letdown to discover that the solution is actually something which is a very familiar kind of approach to the people who are here at this conference, which is that we can do that using iterative learning models. So in an iterated learning model, in the simplest kind of model, we might imagine that we have a sequence of learners, each of whom is learning from data generated by the previous learner, and then forming a hypothesis about the process that produced those data, and using that hypothesis as the basis for data that they go on to generate, that's then observed by a subsequent learner, and so on, and so on, and so on. But for this model, what we can do is associate each of these steps, where a learner chooses a hypothesis, say, with a probability distribution, PL of H given D, where I just included the L there to indicate that this is dependent on the choice of learning algorithm we postulate for the learner. And we can associate the generation of data with another distribution, PP of D given H, where the P indicates there's some procedure that learners are following to generate data. And think about iterative learning as just a process of iteratively sampling from these probability distributions. And if we do that, then we can write down a probability, which is the probability that a learner with a particular hypothesis here, let's see, the probability that a learner with a particular hypothesis will produce a subsequent learner who has a different hypothesis. So more formally, we can write down these probabilities, Qij, that tell us the chance that you'll end up with hypothesis I, given that you learned from somebody who had a hypothesis J, just by summing over the data. So we just say, what's the chance that you get a particular piece of data D from that previous learner, and then what's the probability that you select the hypothesis J, given that you observe those data D, and then we just sum over all of the possible pieces of data that you could have seen. And that gives us these transmission probabilities that characterize the sort of mutation that underlies this process. So that gives us a way of defining the QIJs, but iterated learning goes beyond that. It actually gives us a mechanism that we can use for evaluating the consequences of transmission and give us a characterization of the outcome of these kind of neutral models. So more formally, what we can do is observe that iterated learning defines something that's called a Markov chain on the hypotheses that learners consider. And a Markov chain is just a sequence of random variables where each variable in the sequence is independent of all preceding variables when conditioned on the one that immediately precedes it in the sequence. Basically, this is saying that, when you're playing telephone, the message that you end up with depends just on the message that was whispered into your ear by the previous person, not by, whatever else people have done earlier in the chain, if you know the message that was whispered by that previous person. And recognizing that it's a Markov chain links us up to a whole nice sort of piece of mathematics which concerns the behavior of Markov chains. In particular, we can make a prediction that over time, the probability that the learner entertains a particular hypothesis is going to converge to a particular distribution, which is called the stationary distribution of that Markov chain. And that gives us a way of characterizing what the outcome of this cultural transmission process is. So what that means is that focusing just on transmission and breaking things down in this way where we're thinking about chains of individual learners gives us a tool that can allow us to do two things. First of all, to get a handle on what those QIJs should be that we should plug into more complex evolutionary models, we can then go back and include fitness and all of the other complicated things we might want to have in there. But also, it turns out that this is sufficient to allow us to determine the equilibrium of a neutral model. So it allows us to actually work out what the outcome would be of following those replicator dynamics in the case where we have uniform fitness. So just to be a little more precise about that, I told you about the replicator dynamics in its general form, where we have the influence of both the mutation, Qij, and the fitness, Fi. If we assume that Fi is constant, then this simplifies down to what we can call a kind of neutral model. The scare quote's there because we're still allowing for directed mutation. So there's basically the dynamics of this model are going to reflect the fact that the Qij could favor some hypotheses over others. But in this model, what we're going to be able to do is to say, if we look at sort of iterating this, this dynamics, and we try and figure out what the equilibria are, so where it is that this process is going to end up after, you just turn me off? No, okay. Where this process is going to end up after, sort of asymptotically large amounts of time, we can work out what that equilibrium will be. And you can see this because the equation that we end up with is just a linear equation that is straightforward to solve, and you can show that the stable equilibrium of this process corresponds to the first eigenvector of this Q matrix, which sounds a little complicated, but it actually also just corresponds directly to the stationary distribution of that iterated learning chain that I showed you before. So to demathematize this, what that means is you can run an iterated learning simulation, and as long as you do it for enough iterations, the probability distribution over languages that it converges to will reflect the proportions of the population who would speak those languages if you had run the replicator dynamics with uniform fitness. So you can get a characterization of what the composition of a population of agents would be, an infinite population, following the replicator dynamics, just by running those iterated learning simulations where you're just simulating a single chain of learners and looking at what distribution over languages that chain converges to. Okay, everybody okay? Pretty much? All right, sorry about that. It's going to get less mathematical. We've got one more piece to get through. Okay, so far I've given you a sort of story about a connection between this familiar iterated learning model and perhaps less familiar kind of evolutionary dynamics. But in order to turn this into a story that we can use to answer our question about the properties of languages that we expect to emerge from these processes, we need to say a little more about these mutation probabilities Qij. And in order to do that, we need to say a little more about the learning algorithms we're going to assume and the production procedures we're going to assume on the parts of the learners. And in order to do that, we need to make a commitment about what kind of learning algorithm we want to use. And basically, we want that learning algorithm to be something which allows us to, in a reasonably expressive way, give a characterization of the inductive bias of a learner. So inductive bias is a term that comes from machine learning. It basically means all of those factors other than the data which influence the choice of hypotheses that a learner ends up making. So you can think about this as reflecting things like innate constraints, but also the other sorts of things that learners might bring to the table when they're trying to decide between the hypotheses that they could use to interpret linguistic data that they've observed. Things like their experience in other domains or other kinds of things like that. So we want to be able to talk about a learning algorithm that makes these inductive biases transparent. And in order to do that, I'm going to use Bayesian Inference. This is the Reverend Bayes, who introduced his famous theorem in the 18th century, which tells us how it is that a rational learner should go about updating his or her beliefs in light of evidence. So what Bayes' theorem tells us how to do is how to go from what's called a prior probability distribution, which encodes our degrees of belief in a set of hypotheses before we see data, to a posterior probability distribution, which encodes our degrees of belief after seeing data. And it tells us how to do that in a very simple way. It says, start with your prior probability distribution, multiply by what's called the likelihood, which gives you the probability of seeing those data if that hypothesis were true, and then normalize. So, just like in our previous equation, there was a term you could ignore. This is the term that you could ignore here. This is just making sure that our probabilities sum up to 1 at the end of the day. So Bayes' rule breaks down to a very simple kind of formula, which says, take what you believed before, your prior distribution over hypotheses, multiply by the likelihood, how consistent they are with the evidence that you saw, and then you'll end up with how much you should believe in each of those hypotheses down the line. So the reason why this makes inductive biases transparent is because it basically separates out the two terms, one of which corresponds to what the learner is bringing to the table before they get the linguistic data that they see, and one which characterizes how well those linguistic data are described by particular hypotheses. So if you're thinking about those hypotheses as being grammars, or they could be neural network weights, or whatever it is that you're thinking about your learners trying to infer from data, the prior probability distribution is going to capture the constraints on learning that are guiding that learner. It's going to capture the things other than the data which are influencing the solutions that they end up adopting. And so this gives us a nice, clear way of saying how it is that those constraints on the part of the learner influence the conclusions that they reach. As a consequence, it gives us a tool that we can use for then trying to connect biases of individual learners to the outcomes of these evolutionary processes. And so we can do this by taking our iterative learning model and making a small substitution. We stick in the ref from Bayes. What I'm going to do to start off with is assume that the learning algorithm that we're going to define is one which says learners are choosing their hypotheses by sampling from posterior distributions. So what that means is they see data, they compute a posterior distribution, they generate a sample from that distribution, and that gives them the hypothesis that they end up with. And then based on that hypothesis, they generate data from some distribution, and we assume that all of the learners have the same prior distribution, so they're all bringing the same biases to the table, and that the likelihood function that they use corresponds to the procedure by which data are produced. So they kind of have a veridical understanding of how it is that a particular hypothesis about language maps onto the way in which linguistic data would be generated by somebody who is maintaining that hypothesis. So what we can show, this is joint work with Mike Kalish, is that in this case there's a very simple characterization of the stationary distribution of iterative learning and correspondingly the equilibrium of the neutral replicator dynamics. And this equilibrium is just the prior distribution that's assumed by the learners. So what this means is that the probability that an individual learner is going to learn a language is just going to converge to the prior probability of that language regardless of the first language in the chain. So basically it gives us a very direct connection between the inductive biases of learners, the constraints that are assumed on learning, and the outcomes of these iterative learning processes. Or if we frame this in terms of the replicator dynamics, the proportion of the population who learn a language is going to converge to the prior probability of that language in exactly the same way. So there are a few things to take away from this. I think the basic conclusion is that what it illustrates is that even these neutral models can be very powerful. So even taking out fitness and all of the interactions between agents which are characterized by more complex models and just focusing on transmission, we can nonetheless get out interesting structure. And if what we want to explain is why it is that particular languages are more prevalent than others in the languages that we look across, something like this could give you an explanation along those lines without needing to appeal to sort of cultural analogs of selection. So we got this result. We actually had a conference paper on this result in 2005, and then Simon Kirby was one of the reviewers, and he was kind of concerned about this because it's a very different result from the way that I think people have been thinking about iterative learning before. In particular, it gives us this direct relationship between the biases on the part of the learner and the outcome of iterative learning. It also makes this prediction that you should converge to the prior distribution regardless of the amount of data that's transmitted between learners, which is inconsistent with a kind of idea of iterative learning working like compression or there being an information bottleneck. What we did was go back and reanalyze the assumptions that went into this, and the key assumption here is that learners are sampling from their posterior distributions in order to choose their hypotheses. So what we can do is change this assumption and look at what the consequences are. And in particular, we can change from sampling from the posterior distribution to choosing the hypothesis that has highest posterior probability. And we can do that by taking our posterior distribution and then raising it to a power and then renormalizing that distribution. So basically what that means is if you took a sort of nice sort of normal distribution like this, and then you gradually increase that value of r, what you get is that distribution would become more peaky until the point where as r goes to infinity, it just ends up being a little delta function right on the point that has highest probability. And so as r goes to infinity, what we do is we move towards choosing the hypothesis that has highest posterior probability, what we call maximum a posteriori learning, or mapped learning. So unfortunately, in this case, it's hard to get general analytic results. There's an interesting relationship with a kind of algorithm that's used in statistics, which gives us some asymptotic results and basically indicates that you should expect to converge to a distribution that's centered on points that have high prior probability. But we were able to show, and this is work with Simon and with Mike Dowman, that for certain classes of languages, you can show that the equilibrium gives each hypothesis probability proportional to the prior probability raised to this exponent r. And so what that means is that whatever the ordering over hypotheses is that's assumed by the prior will be preserved, but the extent to which you favor one hypothesis over another is going to be changed based on how much you're getting towards choosing the hypothesis that has highest posterior probability. So if we try and think about the consequences of this, our original result, when we sampling from the posterior, we converge to the prior and we get this one-to-one correspondence between inductive biases and linguistic universals. But as learners move towards maximizing, the influence of the prior is exaggerated, and that means that weak biases can produce strong universals in the way that previous simulations looking at iterative learning had demonstrated. And it also suggests that cultural evolution could then be a viable alternative to traditional explanations for linguistic universals, which relied on the assumption that there are strong constraints on the part of the learner. So I kind of think about this. This is the result I talk about when I go to the east coast of the United States, and this is the one I talk about when I go to the west coast. So, this sets up a formal framework that you can use to answer other mathematical questions, and we've used this to provide other mathematical results, and other people have gone on to build on it. You can do things like work out convergence rates for iterated learning, which basically tells you how long languages would need to be transmitted via these kind of processes in order to lose the influence of a common ancestor. And we can get a bound on that and ask about whether enough time has passed for human languages. We can also do things like look at what happens as other sources of information are integrated into the learning process, to do things like look at how information can accumulate over time, or how it is that dependencies between the way that language is used and the structure of the environment influence the outcome of iterated learning. So there's another line of work has looked at what happens when we relax this simple transmission chain assumption and allow learners to learn from multiple teachers. It turns out that basically that produces a sort of tendency to move towards the most prevalent language in the population. Kenny Smith has some nice results demonstrating that. But we're also able to show that if learners are allowed to learn multiple languages, then that effect is dissipated. And there was some nice work presented at this conference which built on a lot of these results as well. Okay, so we have a set of mathematical results then that give us a characterization of what we think should come out of these processes of iterated learning. But my real training is as a psychologist, and so one of the things that I was interested in is whether this kind of model actually gives us a good description of what happens with real people. And in order to answer that question, we need to go to the lab. So we run a bunch of experiments which simulate iterated learning in the lab. Unlike Simon's experiments, we haven't focused on transmission of languages. What we focused on is cases where we might know something about what people's inductive biases are so that we can test whether the outcome of iterated learning reflects those inductive biases. So an example of this is using function learning, which is a very boring kind of task that's been studied by psychologists for about 40 years. The basic idea is that people get some data which tell us about a relationship between two variables, x and y. They're trying to induce what relationship exists between those variables. And the way it works, they get some xy pairs. They make predictions of y for some new x values, and the predictions that they make are the data that we then provide to the next learner. So if you're creative, you can think about this as corresponding somehow to language, where x could be events that you want to describe, and y could be utterances that describe them. But really, we're going to use this as a tool for trying to figure out whether the outcomes of iterated learning are the things that are predicted by those mathematical models. So the way that this kind of task works the x value corresponds to the width of a bar on the screen. People see that value, they make a prediction about the y value, which is the height of this yellow bar over here. They enter a response by moving the slider up and down, and then when they're done, they click a button, and they get feedback on how well they did. And if they are off by more than a certain amount, they have to do it again. So there's a strong incentive to get the right answer when you're doing the training, because participants in our experiments want nothing more than to be done with the experiment, right? So the reason why we use this boring task is that those 40 years of research in psychology have told us that there's a clear ordering on what people find easy and hard to learn. So the easiest thing to learn is that as the blue bar gets wider, the yellow bar gets taller, a positive linear relationship. Next easiest is as the blue bar gets wider, the yellow bar gets shorter, a negative linear relationship. And then basically anything past that is just hard, right? So the next sort of reasonably easy one is a nonlinear one, where as the blue bar gets longer, the yellow bar starts out long, then gets short, and then gets long again. But really, anything that sort of goes beyond those simple linear functions takes people a while to pick up. It requires more training than the data that we're giving to them. So what that gives us is a prediction, which is that if we do iterated learning with different initial data, we should expect to see convergence to a distribution which is consistent with those inductive biases on the part of our learners. And so we did an experiment which tested that out. Basically, we simulated iterated learning with our real human participants, and we did this over 9 generations. I'm going to switch to this other microphone. Okay. Okay, so we did this over 9 generations, and each of our chains, we'd start out giving them some initial data, then these are the predictions that are produced by the first learner, and then based on those predictions, these are the predictions that are produced by the second learner, right? We give those as data to the third learner produces predictions that look like this. Everyone gets the theme here, right? Okay, and then when we look across the end of our chain, this positive linear function has been transmitted faithfully. What's interesting about this is that it turns out that this is the exception rather than the rule. So if we start out with a negative linear function, we get out a positive linear function. And it really doesn't matter much what we start out with. We end up with that positive linear function coming out. And so we did this 32 times. 28 of those times we ended up with a positive linear function, and the other 4 times we ended up with a negative linear function. So that's consistent with the pattern of biases that have been shown in the previous literature. And we've done other experiments using other domains where we know something about what people's biases are like in order to evaluate whether this approach is producing appropriate predictions. And we find in each of these cases that it does seem like what's coming out is something which is reflecting the inductive biases that people are bringing to these tasks. But a more interesting question is what happens if we look at domains where there are things that we actually want to explain using these kinds of processes. So if we go after particular linguistic universals or properties of languages, can we show that this kind of process of transmission is sufficient to account for the regularities that we see in those domains? And so we've started to do a couple of experiments which look at this. I'll tell you about one of them. This is an experiment with Jin Xu and Mike Dowman, where what we took as our learning task was a learning system of color terms. And so the basic idea is that you would get some colors shown to you on a computer screen, which are selected from sort of simulated color chips, which are fit into the World Color Survey color array, which has been used to test to identify the systems of color terms used by speakers of 110 pre-industrial societies. You would see some examples of color terms that are drawn from that array, and then you are asked to generalize the color terms that you saw to the remaining elements that appear in that array. So each learner would see a set of labeled patches of colors, make predictions of the labels for new patches, and the predictions that they make would then become the data that the next learner would see. So the task looked kind of like this. These are your sort of training examples shown in these different bins here. You see a new color, and then you're asked what word applies to this, and then you make a decision as to which of those bins you want to put it into. So we can simulate, we can use this to do another laboratory simulation and look at what comes out of it. And what we're interested in doing is comparing to the actual distribution of systems of color terms that we see across human societies as reflected in the World Color Survey. So here's how I'm going to show you the results. On the top is the array that's used in the World Color Survey, and then each of these panels below shows a partition that's produced by one of our participants. Actually, here, these are just the initial partitions that are used to start off the chains. And so the different colors that appear in those plots below just correspond to the division of the set of patches into respectively 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 sets. So we start off with random partitions. Those are, we use those to generate examples that are shown to the participants. In this case, they get 6 examples, I think, per color term. And then this is the responses of that first participant in each of those chains, and you can see they're beginning to introduce a little bit of order. And then those generate the data which are provided to the next learner, and then we keep on doing this. And basically what we can see over time is that there's some regularity which is emerging in these chains, and we can compare those regularities to, say, the languages that appear in the World Color Survey. So the bottom row down here shows the closest World Color Survey language to the responses of the participants on each of these chains, where these are the mode maps taken across a large number of speakers, so they're much less noisy than the responses of the individual participants in our experiment. But what you should be able to see if you kind of look at this and squint is that there's some correspondence that's clearly emerging in these cases. For example, when we have 2 color terms, we get something which is basically reflecting a division along lightness, which is the sort of vertical dimension here, or occasionally a division along hue, but the lightness and hue boundaries tend to correspond to the things that we actually see in boundary. Or if we have 3 terms, then pretty consistently we get solutions which have sort of a darker light and a red term. And then 3 terms and 4 terms and 5 terms. It becomes a little harder to see as we go further along, but there are some clear correspondences. So we can quantify this by measuring the distance between the systems that are produced by our speakers and systems that appear in the World Color Survey. And we do this using an information theoretic metric called the variation of information. So this is a metric where the value is larger as the distance is greater. And so what we can do is look at how that changes over time. And so this is showing the variation of information as a function of the number of iterations of our experiment. And basically what we find is that the distance to the World Color Survey decreases as a function of time. And in fact, when we look at the distance between 2 randomly selected speakers in the World Color Survey, that distance is basically on par with the point that our speakers end up converging to. So while there's still a lot of variation in the responses that our speakers are producing, the variation at least seems consistent with the results that we see in the World Color Survey. And this provides the suggestion that it may be the case that we can account for some of these regularities that we see across languages as a consequence just of transmission without needing to appeal to more complicated processes of interaction between agents or other processes of sort of cultural analogs of selection. Okay, so to sum up this part of the talk, iterative learning gives us a way of isolating forces like mutation via cultural transmission from other evolutionary forces. We can use this as a mechanism for estimating the parameters that we want to plug into more complicated models, but we can also determine the equilibria which are produced by these transmission processes. These transmission mechanisms are actually things that result in strong and interesting mutation forces. So unlike the biological case, we're getting out things which are sort of interesting structured equilibria as a consequence of the inductive biases of our learners. And that in these cases, it seems like the kind of directed mutation that's produced by those inductive biases could provide an alternative to selection for explaining certain aspects of linguistic universals. So the last thing I'm going to do reasonably quickly is sort of give a similar kind of argument applied at the element level. So that was an analysis where we were thinking about the things that are evolving as whole languages that are being passed from person to person. But we can also think about evolution operating on this level of individual elements where what's changing is the proportion of those elements in the language. So in this case, what we want to be able to do is to characterize how it is that the frequencies of different constructions change over time. And we can get a handle on that by thinking about what happens if we look at iterated learning of frequencies. So here the basic idea is that we're going to use the same kind of model, but now we're going to think about the data that are being transmitted as a vector of the frequencies of different kinds of constructions, and the hypotheses that are being entertained as estimates of the proportions of those constructions that appear in the population, that appear in the language. And so this is going to be our sort of estimate of the probability of different types in the population. Based on that, we're going to generate new data, another set of frequencies of different constructions, and then make an inference about the proportions. So we can define a simple Bayesian iterated learning model for frequencies if we just have these, say, 2 variants, where there are 2 constructions that we're choosing between, If we assume that the data that we're getting are drawn from a binomial distribution, which is just your normal sort of flipping a coin distribution, where the weight of the coin is theta, and we define a particular prior distribution on theta, which is called a beta distribution. And I'll show you what a beta distribution looks like in a moment. And you can generalize this to the case where there are multiple variants just by making a change in the name of that prior distribution, but the basic idea is the same. So what this beta distribution corresponds to is an assumption about the value of theta, the value of that coin toss, or the proportion of the population which corresponds to a particular variant. And the beta distribution is a very rich kind of family of distributions that allows us to capture different kinds of things that are linguistically interesting. So, for example, we can have a beta distribution that looks like this, which is something which favors values of theta which are close to 0 or close to 1. So this distribution is favoring kind of regularization. It's trying to get us to end up with a language which has very little probabilistic variation. And we can contrast that with a distribution which says that we want to have values which are close to 0.5, or a distribution that says, I have no beliefs about the value of theta. I don't have expectations about what the probabilistic variation that exists in a language would be like. We can then plug those straight into those models that I was talking about before and look at what consequences they have for the evolution of frequencies. So here, this is looking at, if we assume, say, that you're getting a sample of, say, 10 constructions which are drawn by flipping that coin, and we start out with an initial language which has 5 of one construction and 5 of the other construction, we can look at how the frequencies of those constructions vary over time. So here, as we go down, this is the number of iterations that have passed, and the intensity of grayscale indicates the corresponding probability, with darker corresponding to high probability. So if you have a prior that favors regularization, you shouldn't be surprised, based on the things I was saying before, that what happens is you favor languages which have sort of elimination of that probabilistic variation. If you have a prior that favors probabilistic variation, then that's maintained. And if you have a prior that's agnostic, you gradually, slowly converge to a uniform distribution across those frequencies. So if you kind of look at these plots a little bit, and this one in particular, then it might remind you of something that you saw before. So in fact, it looks very much like this kind of plot of what happens if you take a finite population and breed the members of that population. It looks a lot like genetic drift. And that's not a coincidence. A standard mathematical model of genetic drift is something called the Wright-Fisher model. Basically, the idea is that you have X copies of a gene in a population of n individuals. And the idea is that at each generation, you say that the number of copies of the gene is going to be drawn from that binomial distribution, the coin flipping distribution, with parameter theta, where theta is just the current proportion of the population. And if you allow mutation, this becomes a little more complicated. You're still drawing by flipping that coin, but the coin is weighted in a particular way, which takes into account the fact that it's possible to change between having the gene and not having the gene. And so here U and V characterize the rates of mutation in those two directions. So you can actually show that this Wright-Fisher model is mathematically equivalent to that Bayesian model of iterated learning for frequencies that I mentioned. So basically, the standard Wright-Fisher model corresponds to Bayesian estimation of frequencies, where you're just maximizing over the posterior distribution. And if you have mutation, then it corresponds to a particular choice of beta prior, where the parameters of that prior distribution are determined by the assumptions that you make about mutation in the model. So this again sets us up in a situation where we've got a nice mathematical model, it makes some predictions, and we'd like to test it out. So what we did was went to the lab and looked at what happened if you actually simulate these processes of iterated learning of frequencies with real human learners. So in order to do this, we used a paradigm which is used by Athena Voluminos, which is a word learning paradigm, where basically you see these novel objects and you hear labels being applied to those objects. So for example, you could see this object mixed in with a whole bunch of other objects, and of the 10 times you see it, 5 times it might be labeled duck, and 5 times it might be labeled neck. And the question is, what do you infer about the distribution over labels associated with objects? So the way that we do this experiment, everybody sees some objects that receive 2 labels. They produce labels for those objects to test, and then the first person in the sequence would see those labels. Basically, every person in the experiment sees 6 different objects, and for the first person, we set those initial, the frequencies of those labels to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 out of 10. So we've got 6 conditions which represent different initial frequencies, which they see the labels being applied. where here this corresponds to the sort of the minority label, which is randomly selected from the two labels that can be applied to that object. So the reason why we use this paradigm was that when Voluminos originally did her experiment, she observed what she identified as probability matching. So basically, how often people saw something determined how often they would produce that in their responses. And so this is a little surprising because other experiments by people like Carl Hudson-Cam had suggested that even with adult learners, you see some tendency towards regularization of languages. That is, a tendency to reduce probabilistic variation in the language. And so we were interested, this is basically a question about inductive biases, whether we could identify this pattern of inductive bias in adult learners using this kind of task. So if we look at just the first generation, then what we see is something that's very consistent with probability matching. So basically here the dark bars show the proportion of the frequency of the target label in people's responses, and the light bars show the frequency in training. And you can see there's a close correspondence between the dark and the light bars. And so this kind of suggests probability matching. But what we see if we iterate this process is that, in fact, people actually do have a regularization bias. It's just not something that you see after a single generation. So here, shown along the top, 6 panels corresponding to those 6 conditions, which were initialized with different values of the frequency of that label. And then each of the lines that appears in the plot corresponds to one sequence of 5 participants. And what you should be able to see is that for each of these plots, after those 5 iterations, basically all of the languages that we end up with have either 0 or 10 instances of the label, which means that they've converged to a fully regularized deterministic form. And this is consistent with models of the kind that I was talking about, under the assumption that you have one of those beta priors that strongly favors regularization. So it suggests that people have a bias, which is that they want to eliminate the probabilistic variation in the system of labels applied to these objects. We've used the same model that we tested out in the lab and looked at what sort of large-scale properties it has when you think about applying this in the context of language evolution more generally. So you can show that, for example, this kind of model produces an S-shaped curve of language change. So basically this kind of accelerating rate of replacement and a deceleration in the rate of replacement over time. And so I'm not going to go through the details here for the sake of time, but basically this phenomenon only emerges if you have a prior that favors regularization of the model, consistent with what we found in the lab. You can also define a version of this model which has infinitely many variants. What that means is that it allows for the possibility of the creation of a new word or sound or construction at any particular generation of learning. Again, it's a little complex to explain exactly how this works, but basically it's a straightforward generalization of that model that I illustrated to you with just the 2 variants. And this infinitely many variant model has a correspondence to another model which is used in population genetics, something called the infinite allele model, which is also linked to the coalescent model that Russell mentioned in his talk. And it turns out that it has, just using this simple model, predicts some of the statistical regularities that you see in human languages. For example, it produces Zipf's law just through simple transmission of languages using this prior distribution, and it also produces an inverse power law and lexical replacement. So this is just showing a prediction that comes out of that model. If we have a population and we look at the frequency of an item and try and relate the frequency of the item to the rate at which it disappears from the population, we find an inverse power law relationship which is consistent with what's seen in human data. Okay, so to wrap up, if we look at this element level, we can actually sort of think about what's going on in terms of the changes of frequencies through production and estimation. The simplest Bayesian model of frequency estimation gives us back these classic models of genetic drift, which gives us a tool for looking at the consequences of mutation and drift when we're studying language evolution. And this simple neutral model is sufficient to produce some basic linguistic phenomena, things like S-shaped curves, Zipf's law, and power law relationships between regularity and frequency. So the overall argument here is that there are many different ways that we can think about evolutionary dynamics applying to language, and there are many different evolutionary forces that we can think about applying. But iterative learning gives us a way of starting to develop neutral models of language evolution. That is, models that allow us to look at questions about what kind of evolutionary forces we think are at work in explaining particular kinds of phenomena. In particular, it illustrates that when we're thinking about cultural evolution as opposed to biological evolution, mutation is not a boring process. It's actually a very powerful process, something which has the potential to explain many of the kinds of things that we're interested in accounting for in the structure of languages that we see. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We can, I think, answer a few questions.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting. I was wondering, but you went a little quickly, I was wondering whether an assumption in your analysis is not that there is just discrete inheritance. So would you be able to deal with blended inheritance, which seems to be some aspects of language and culture?
Yeah, so the language level models assume discrete inheritance. I talked a little bit about sort of allowing multilingualism, which gives you a way of doing a limited kind of blending. And basically, you still have discreteness in what the individuals are learning. They're going to learn particular discrete languages, but they can be learning from multiple people and learning different things from those people. For the models which are about the sort of element level transmission, there's more opportunity for that because what's changing is kind of the represented proportion of different kinds of constructions in the population. And so I think that gives you more room for thinking about those kinds of things.
Thank you for that talk. I find these models and this enterprise extremely elegant, but perhaps reflecting my roots as a connectionist, epistemologically unsatisfying. One specific concern is that the models assume an existing hypothesis space. And of course, the Bayesian formalism is the optimal method for choosing the most likely hypothesis from that space given the data. In the experiments, likewise, it seems in these particular kinds of experiments, people have a discrete hypothesis they're testing. Is one line getting bigger, the other one's getting smaller, and so on. And so the experiments fit the models quite nicely. But in the case of children, for instance, acquiring language, that space, unless one believes that it's all innately predetermined and kids sort of know all possible languages and are choosing among them, but the space itself has to be constructed. And so I was wondering whether the enterprise is heading in that direction, and this is the question of where the priors come from, where the inductive bias come from, or whether you think that's not quite relevant.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing is you shouldn't be worried by me talking about hypotheses and hypothesis spaces and so on. That's an abstract way of describing learning, which can be cashed out in many different ways. So connectionist models you can express very cleanly in a Bayesian framework like this as, you can say you have a hypothesis space of weights, and you're trying to identify what set of weights you should have based on the data, and different learning algorithms correspond to different choices about prior distributions on weights, and so on and so on and so on. So I don't think anything that I've said is inconsistent with thinking about things in a way where learners don't have explicit hypothesis spaces. I think it's an interesting question whether that's the right mechanism for characterizing learning in the experiments that I've talked about, or there might be other things at work, but there's nothing in the formalism which is making an argument about a particular kind of mechanism being inside people's heads. It's more, we just need this to be a mathematical way that we can characterize learning in abstract, and it allows things like connectionism within that framework. Am I choosing people? Or? Okay. So, yeah.
Thank you. I find it a little hard to believe that we can't see any evidence for regular information bias in one generation of learners. So I was wondering if there was any evidence for this bias in individual learners that might get lost with the average overall.
Yeah, I just lost my slide, but we looked at that. And we did some deeper sort of individual level analyses, and it was really, it's very hard to detect. And basically, you can think about it, the way that those priors that I was talking about work is they just sort of add a little bit to the sort of estimated frequencies, just like mutation is just going to change those probabilities a little bit. And so you could probably, if you got enough subjects, detect it looking at, the proportions that appear after a single generation. But doing the experiment that we did, you could use an equivalent number of subjects and get a very clear picture of what the prior distribution looks like. Yeah. There's one question in the middle there. And then, do you want me to wrap up? So this last one? Yep. Okay, last question.
Is there any way we can estimate the time scales over which these processes operate, and does that help us choose between models?
Yeah, so So like I said, there's a connection between the sampling version of the model and something called Gibbs Sampling, which is a Markov Chain Monte Carlo algorithm that's been extensively analyzed by statisticians. And so connections to that and other kinds of Markov chains, like processes for shuffling cards, give you analytic convergence rates, which tell you how long you expect it to take to reach the stationary distribution. So under the assumption that you have that simple model where you just have a chain of learners, if you have a population that's using, say, a simplified kind of principles and parameters learning scheme where they've got n binary parameters that they want to set, of which m might be not sufficiently determined by the linguistic data that they get, where m could be a fraction, then you can show that the time to converge from, the time to lose an influence of a common ancestor is n log n divided by m. And so, if you can make appropriate estimates of n and m from the hypotheses of linguists and the data that we have about language change, then you can get bounds on whether enough time has passed to lose the influence of a common ancestor. And based on our analyses, using that kind of math, we're kind of right at the boundary in terms of hypotheses that people have about the times to origins and things like that. But that's using that simplest kind of model, which is probably wrong, right? So we've done other simulations where we looked at more complex models, and basically what they tend to do is extend the time to convergence. So there's still a possibility of an influence of a common ancestor, but it's something which I think is a speculative enterprise until you can really nail down what the right kind of model of learning is.
Thank you very much.